Fires have torn through millions of hectares and claimed hundreds of homes, and 6 Australians have tragically lost their lives. Rural communities and firefighters are exhausted. Sydney is in a haze of smoke. In this bushfire emergency, is it time now for national leadership to bring new responses through a summit with all levels of government to discuss the best ways to manage national parks and the risks of people living in fire-prone areas? We have more hot days ahead. Is it time for a better crisis management plan for our fires?
Malcolm Turnbull, we'll start with you.
Well, the answer is yes. We have to recognise we have a hotter and drier climate. That's the consequence of global warming, and that's going to mean more fires and hotter fires. And these fires can be 1,000 degrees Celsius. They will melt everything except steel. You know, our firefighters, who we must honour and thank here and support, are taking on unimaginable challenges, getting worse all the time. And so we do have to come together and recognise that the situation with fires is going to become worse. That is the inevitable consequence of a hotter and drier climate, and that means we need stronger and more coordinated responses. We have to support our firefighters as they put themselves and their lives on the line to keep us safe.
So, Malcolm Turnbull, is it time to actually recognise this as a national security threat and build a national force, well-equipped, possibly with its own fleet of aerial bombers, to actually take this on? Because as of now, there's been no national response.
Well, it's always been, as you know, essentially a state and local government issue. And of course, the fire, here in New South Wales, the Rural Fire Service is largely a volunteer force. But you know, the reality is, as Elaine's just said, we are seeing more and hotter fires. It is the consequence of a hotter and drier climate, as our Nobel Prize-winning physicist, I'm sure, will confirm. You know, that is not rocket science. That is what you get if you have a hotter and drier climate, more fires and hotter fires. And so we have to review the measures we've got to defend ourselves against fires and upgrade and improve them, because the challenge has changed, so you cannot keep on responding in the same way you have in the past. And the fire chiefs that have, the retired former fire chiefs that have been creating a sort of coalition in respect of this have been talking about having more water bombers, and that, you know, they're the experts. We've got to be guided by them.
Well, there were 23 of them earlier this year. They urgently tried to meet the Prime Minister over a number of months. He refused to meet them. Now, I'm just wondering whether that was the appropriate response from a national leader when 23 of the leading firefighters and emergency leaders from the past decades come forward to make their case.
Well, I'll leave Albo to critique ScoMo, that's his day job. But I think whether regardless of the meetings and who you meet with and so forth, you get back to this reality. Look, you know, the fires, I'll just tell you about a fire. Remember the Black Saturday fires in Victoria in 2009? Lucy and I went to the fire ground after those fires, and there were many people killed there. They were shocking tragedy. And we saw cars which had been caught up in the fire, which people had been in, and there was nothing left except the steel. The glass had melted and flowed down over the car, over what was left of the dashboard and the floor. The aluminium in the wheels had melted and was left run out on the ground. That is what our firefighters and our communities in rural areas and areas around our cities are facing. And so we have to recognise this is a national security issue. I mean, when Australians' lives are at risk, when they are being threatened, when their families and their homes and their crops and their properties and everything they hold dear is being put at threat, that's a national security issue. If it isn't a national security issue, what is? And it requires a national response.
The national government to deal with.
The national government has to provide leadership
Okay.
That's what the Australian government does. I mean, when we had the terrible truck attacks, for example, in Europe, you remember the terrible attack in Nice on the terrorists drove the truck down the road there. As Prime Minister, I brought together all the state leaders, state police, local government, the private sector, and said, right, we need to have and coordinate a crowded places strategy. This has, obviously the federal government can't do everything, but the federal government's job is to lead. And this is an issue that needs leadership. We cannot kid ourselves that we are not going to face more and hotter fires. That is the consequence of global warming.
Okay, we'll come back to you on that. Pat Turner, you want to get in?
Yes, I do. And thank you very much for the question, Elaine, because it's been a tragedy, really, to see our country just being erased. And I think that there's a lot that Australia has to learn from my people, the Aboriginal people, who cared for this country for 60,000 years, who have very sound fire management practices that could easily be adapted into modern Australia and could also create sound employment opportunities. But it has to be land management on an annual basis, year in, year out. You can't just have clearance happening just before summer. And, you know, the water bombers and all of those things are great and they do a fantastic job, but you've got to have the water to pick up in the first place. And we're running very short of that. So I just think that some land management practices that have been employed by Aboriginal people can easily be learnt and adapted, and our people could get some sound employment opportunities by being able to be employed in land management roles on an annual basis, year in, year out, to make sure that the environment is cared for as it should be.
Okay, Anthony Albanese, thank you very much. You just heard Malcolm Turnbull call for a national response. We haven't seen that yet. Do you agree with the questioner that's what is required?
I do, and I wrote to Scott Morrison 3 weeks ago. He wrote back to me saying it wasn't required and that everything was in hand. Well, quite clearly it's not. And I agree with Malcolm that this is an issue that needs leadership, but it also needs coordination. Yes, the state governments will be responsible for emergency services, but fires don't recognise state boundaries. Local government doesn't recognise that the fires aren't burning in one local government area. At the moment, here there is a single fire that is burning from the Hawkesbury right up to Singleton, a single fire. And we know that this is connected with climate change. And to say that is not to dismiss the need to deal with the immediate, which is keeping people safe, keeping property safe, the immediate response. But we need to accept that we need adaptation, we need mitigation, we also need a long-term plan to deal with climate change, because you have areas that are burning that have not burned before because they're drier because of what's been happening on this continent in recent times. This is an emergency. It's affecting our security, it's affecting our health, it's affecting the economy, and it's affecting the environment. And there hasn't been, this is the first year for many years in which there's been just one COAG meeting. There was due to be a meeting in the latter half of this year and it was cancelled. Now, if there's some inconvenient facts to be found about investments that should have been made, well, so be it. We need to actually ensure that we respond, and the national government should be providing leadership on these issues.
What about a national firefighting force ready with its own fleet of water bombers, for example?
Well, I mean, that was one of the points I raised, a number of points that have been raised, not because I'm an expert, have been raised by the experts. I met with Greg Mullins and the former fire chiefs in Canberra. These are men and women who have been working their whole lives. They're essentially mainly retired people, people who've been running rural fire services, running emergency services, running national parks, who know what is going on. And surely, and I agree with Pat's suggestion as well, we could learn a hell of a lot from First Nations people who did look after the land in much better than those who've arrived since. And we should be prepared to consider any measures, but that happens through dialogue. That's how you get solutions.
Yeah, I've got to say this. I mean, is there a Canberra bubble here? Because we had a whole week of Parliament last week. Labor didn't ask a single question on this subject.
Well, that's not right. Well, that's not right, Tony. We had a whole response in terms of a statement from the Prime Minister, a statement from me that responded. I put...
There were no questions in question time, that's what I'm saying.
That's not the only part of Parliament, Tony, as you know. We have responded on those issues, and on a range of issues we actually tried to raise, and we were shut down on 30 occasions in Parliament last week.